A second section of the amendment dealt with the problem of Negro suffrage. This innovation, to the regret of the more extreme radicals, was not required. Instead, a state that denied the suffrage to any of its male inhabitants over 21 years of age, quote, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, end of quote, would merely have its basis of representation in Congress and in the Electoral College correspondingly reduced. This was not an unreasonable position. The old 3/5 compromise of the Constitution, which for such purposes counted 5 slaves as equal to 3 whites, had lost its meaning, for slavery had been abolished. But with freedmen counted exactly the same as whites, the number of representatives from the southern states in Congress and the number of southern votes in the Electoral College would be materially increased. If, therefore, the Negroes were denied the vote and the southern whites were not, the curious result would be to give the latter a great weight in the Union than they had had before the war. The curious result would be to give the latter a greater weight in the Union than they had had before the war. Thus, the amendment held out an inducement to the South to permit the Negroes to vote, but the penalty for failure to do so was slight. I'm going to reread that because it wasn't entirely clear to me. A second section of the amendment dealt with the problem of Negro suffrage. This innovation, to the regret of the more extreme radicals, was not required. Instead, a state that denied the suffrage to any of its male inhabitants over 21 years of age, quote, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, end of quote, would merely have its basis of representation in Congress and in the Electoral College correspondingly reduced. This was not an unreasonable position. The old 3/5 compromise of the Constitution, which for such purposes counted 5 slaves as equal to 3 whites, had lost its meaning, for slavery had been abolished. But with freedmen counted exactly the same as whites, the number of representatives from the southern states in Congress and the number of southern votes in the Electoral College would be materially increased. If, therefore, the Negroes were denied the vote and the southern whites were not, the curious result would be to give the latter a greater weight in the Union than they had had before the war. Thus, the amendment held out an inducement to the South to permit the Negroes to vote, but the penalty for failure to do so was slight. The third section of the amendment was designed to make ineligible for office holding all the ex-Confederate leaders, regardless of whatever presidential pardons they might have received. Anyone who, after taking an oath of office under the United States, had aided the Confederacy might not again hold office unless Congress by a 2/3 vote of each house should remove the disability. Thaddeus Stevens was bitterly disappointed that the right to vote was not included in the disability, but although the House dare not disagree with him, the Senate refused to take so extreme a position, and he was forced to yield the point. A fourth section provided that the debt of the United States incurred to preserve the Union should never be questioned, and that the debt of the southern states and the Confederacy incurred to destroy it should never be paid. This portion of the amendment was meant to allay the fear that the Democrats, if ever they should regain control of the government, would use their power to repudiate the national debt. Also to ensure that the provisions in the Southern state constitutions against the payment of the Confederate debt must be observed. A fifth section of the amendment gave Congress the power to enforce its provisions by appropriate legislation. By the time the amendment was offered, the midterm congressional elections of 1866 were close at hand, and Congress refused to proceed further with its work until the people had been heard from. While in general the effective portion of the press seemed to favor the radicals, there were mutterings of discontent at the long-continued exclusion of the South from representation in Congress, and Johnson's appeals to moderate sentiment had not been wholly in vain. As a discreet gesture of friendliness toward the South, more apparent than real, the state of Tennessee, which in July 1866 reiterated its loyalty to the Union by ratifying the 14th Amendment, was declared by act of Congress fully restored. As for the other 10 states, every one of which rejected the 14th Amendment as promptly as possible, all depended upon the outcome of the election. In case the radicals were able to retain control of Congress, the president's plan would be completely overthrown. But if the supporters of the president could only increase their numbers enough to prevent the overriding of presidential vetoes, then the president's plan might yet succeed. A part of the president's strategy in the campaign was to emphasize the name and the history of the Union Party that had elected him to the vice presidency in 1864. His friends in Congress took the lead in calling a National Union Convention to meet at Philadelphia in August in order to endorse his program. When the convention met, however, it was apparent that Republicans were far less in evidence than Democrats, both Northern and Southern. The main body of the Republicans, including many who had once been Democrats, followed the congressional leaders rather than the president. Because the president's enemies wished also to retain the Union label, there was much confusion as to party names during the election. But it was not difficult to see that the president would have to look mainly to the Democrats for his support, and that the terms radical and Republican were rapidly becoming synonymous. Johnson opened his campaign with great hope of success, but the trend of events soon turned against him. Among his most effective but usually unseen enemies were the northeastern industrialists, who had come to identify their growing prosperity with a continuance of radical control of the government. They feared that the return of Southerners to the national councils might result in a revival of the old alliance between the agricultural South and the agricultural West that would imperil their interests. The agreeably high rates of the Morrill Tariff, for example, had been an impossibility until the South seceded. Would the return of the South bring them down? Holders of United States bonds were frightened by the bugaboo that a revived democracy, composed largely of Northern ex-Copperheads and Southern ex-Confederates, might, if it won control of the government, repudiate the war debt, or, quite as bad, pay it off in depreciated paper currency. The radicals in Congress had also taken a benevolent attitude toward governmental assistance to railroad building, toward the rapid elimination of the income taxes and internal taxes levied during the war, and toward corporation prosperity generally. Could these policies be maintained with the South back in the Union? This thesis is strongly stated in Howard K. Beale, The Critical Year, a study of Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction, 1930. Supported by such powerful vested interests, the opponents of the president made rapid headway. A congressional campaign committee, well supplied with funds, spread endless propaganda throughout the North about the outrages that Southern whites were perpetrating upon the freedmen. 2 race riots, one at Memphis in May and another at New Orleans in July, in both of which many more Negroes than whites were killed, were seized upon as evidence of what would surely happen if Johnson's plan of Reconstruction were permitted to stand. When the president made a swing around the circle to Chicago, where he laid the cornerstone of a monument to Stephen A. Douglas and back again by a different route to Washington, anti-Johnson demonstrations were systematically organized, which in some instances actually prevented the president from speaking, and in others goaded him into the intemperate utterances for which he was famous. The radical press made the most of his mistakes and burlesqued his speeches so successfully that many of his former supporters were deceived and deserted him. He was repeatedly charged with drunkenness, and although all such charges were demonstrably false, such a well-known person as John Sherman complained that Johnson had, quote, sunk the presidential office to the level of the grog house, end of quote. At the time he was inaugurated, Vice President Johnson was so ill that only the insistence of Lincoln brought him to Washington. To help himself through the ordeal, he took more liquor than in his weakened condition was wise, and cut a sorry spectacle. He was deeply humiliated by this incident, and although he did not become an abstainer, he was never again publicly drunk. Thomas Nast, the cartoonist, and Petroleum V. Nasby, the favorite wit of the time, did their able best to make the president appear ridiculous. By the time the election was held, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The radicals carried both houses of Congress by staggering majorities, and the total defeat of the president's program was assured. When Congress reassembled in December 1866, the triumphant radicals took quick advantage of their victory, confirmed in their power to pass laws over the president's veto. They meant to set up a congressional dictatorship that would reduce the president to the role of a well-disciplined clerk, if indeed it did not dispense with his services altogether. To ensure that he should have no breathing spell between Congresses, a new law set the 4th of March instead of the first Monday in December as the beginning date for a session of Congress. Thus, when on the 3rd of March next, the existing or 39th Congress should come to an end, it could rest assured that on the next day its successor, the 40th Congress, would be on hand to carry on. By another law, the Tenure of Office Act, Congress made it a misdemeanor, punishable by fine and imprisonment, for the president to remove civil office holders without the consent of the Senate. The purpose of this law was to save from dismissal such radical officials as the president had not already removed from office, and perhaps to lay a trap that might at length remove the president himself from the scene. Still another law, in utter defiance of the Constitution, sought to destroy the president's power as commander-in-chief of the army. Believing that Grant, who now held the exalted rank of general, would bow to their will, the radicals induced Congress to forbid the president to issue military orders, except through the general of the army, or to relieve the general of his command or assign him to duty elsewhere than in Washington, unless by his own consent or by consent of the Senate. All contrary orders were declared void, and officers who obeyed them were made subject to heavy penalties. By the same act, such militia as had been organized in any of the seceded states was declared disbanded, and its organization or use without the consent of Congress was forbidden. The scene was thus set for an era of ruthless legislative usurpation of executive prerogatives. C. E. Chadsey. That name is the letter C, the letter E, and then Chadsey. C. E. Chadsey, The Struggle Between President Johnson and Congress Over Reconstruction, 1896. This book is still useful. Even before the 4th of March, the radicals persuaded Congress to enact a new plan of Reconstruction far more drastic than the plan they had embodied in the 14th Amendment, and a supplementary act passed after the 4th of March showed the new Congress to be in thorough accord with the old. These laws, in spite of the fact that 2 years had elapsed since the end of the war, were designed to undo completely all that Lincoln and Johnson had done to restore normal civil government in the 10 southern states unrecognized by Congress. Military rule was to be resumed, with the South divided into 5 military districts and an officer of the United States Army not below the rank of brigadier general in charge of each. Each general, duly supported by an adequate military force, must register all the legal voters, excluding all who had ever been disfranchised for disloyalty, and admitting Negroes on the same basis as whites. He must then call upon these voters to elect a constitutional convention, which should draw up a new constitution providing for Negro suffrage. If on submission to the voters this constitution should receive a popular majority, the general in charge should order the necessary elections to put it into effect, whereupon if Congress should approve the new constitution, and if the legislature of the state should adopt the 14th Amendment, and if as many as 3/4 of all the states should ratify the 14th Amendment and so make it a part of the national constitution, then and not until then should the representatives and senators of each restored state be considered eligible for admission to the 2 houses of Congress, and then and not until then should federal troops be withdrawn from the state's borders. Furthermore, each of the newly chosen representatives and senators must be able to take the so-called ironclad oath that he had never given voluntary aid to the Confederacy. The key to this plan of Reconstruction was, of course, Negro suffrage. By giving the blacks the vote and by denying it to many whites, the radicals hoped to make sure that the southern states would long remain true to the Republican Party. They feared that without such a provision, the Democratic Party might not only win the ascendancy in the South, but in the national government as well. Education of the Negroes and the belief that their freedom depended upon the preservation of Republican rule was well along, and the new scheme would give abundant time to complete the process. These measures were passed over the presidential vetoes, but the president took good care to enforce their provisions as painstakingly as if he believed in them. The radical Congress thus found it impossible to impeach him for non-enforcement of the Reconstruction Acts as they had hoped to do. So for a case against them, they turned to the Tenure of Office Act, which he seemingly had violated. Edwin M. Stanton, whom Lincoln had appointed Secretary of War, continued under Johnson to hold that office even after he had deserted the president in all but name and had made common cause with the radicals. Several of Lincoln's cabinet appointees, more scrupulous than Stanton, had resigned when they could no longer support Johnson's policies. But Stanton seems to have stayed on precisely in order to act as a kind of spy or informer. Of his close relations with the president's enemies, there can be no doubt. Irritated at length beyond endurance, Johnson in August 1867 asked Stanton to resign, and when Stanton refused, suspended him from office and named the popular General Grant as his ad interim successor. When Congress met again in December 1867, the president explained to the Senate his reasons for the suspension of Stanton and asked that what he had done be confirmed. This action, however, the Senate promptly refused to take, whereupon Grant, in violation of an agreement he had made with Johnson, turned over his office to Stanton. Johnson had supposed that Grant would refuse to make way for Stanton and had hoped that a court case, Stanton versus Grant, would ultimately result in the Tenure of Office Act being held unconstitutional. The president did not hesitate to berate Grant roundly for his failure to live up to the bargain he had made, a course which drove the somewhat bewildered general directly into the arms of the radicals. Thereupon the president, in defiance of the Tenure of Office Act, which all along he had regarded as unconstitutional, attempted to remove Stanton from office, but the Secretary of War in turn defied the president and kept possession. Immensely pleased with so excellent an opening, the radicals in the House of Representatives, led by the now infirm but still indomitable Stevens, brought impeachment charges to the Senate. 9 of the charges dealt with the president's violation of the Tenure of Office Act. The 10th charged the president with attacking Congress in his addresses. And the 11th served as a kind of catch-all for all sorts of presidential misdeeds.